Welcome back. So if you're watching this right now, I think it's safe to assume that you've chosen option number 1 for paper 2. And I'm hoping at this point you've had a chance to watch that first video, the previous video, and in doing that you have a better idea as to who Richard Wright was and the world in which he lived and the things that would play an important role within his life over the course of time. I'm also hopeful that you had, or now you have, at least a better idea in terms of ways that you might be able to approach this paper. Hopeful that this is a little bit easier now than it was even a few minutes ago. So today what we're going to be doing is sort of uncovering this idea of racial consciousness. And you'll see what I mean here in just a second, but basically our theme or idea that's going to run throughout this video is that Richard Wright and people of color like him are going to become conscious, aware of their race as their life continues to progress, okay? So let me start out, and first things first, I'm going to be reading a little bit from Richard Wright, and you can use like a book like what I've got right here, an old-fashioned paper copy of it. You can also use the book that I provided online. Either way, does not matter. I'll give you the chapter and corresponding page numbers and even a roundabout idea as to where I'm talking about in any given time during the book, okay? But let me go ahead and get back to something for a second, because I think to really understand the world in which Richard Wright lives, you've got to understand a thing or two about consciousness. Now, that's a word, consciousness. I bet you've heard of that before, in some form or fashion anyway, okay? To be self-conscious, let's start with that. If you've got maybe a stain on your shirt or something like that, you're a little bit self-conscious about it. But if you're not aware of that stain, if you're not aware that you dripped a little bit of lunch on your shirt, then I guess you might say ignorance is bliss. You're not even thinking to be worried about it because you're not aware of it, okay? And so, it's one of those things where as we become more and more aware of the world around us, it governs what we do in life. It governs how we approach life. You might even say it can govern how far you will go in life. And that's an issue that I'll come back to here in just a second. But for the time being, I want to give you an example, and one that we've actually talked about in class before, okay? If you recall, I was talking about this in the context of the New Deal, the 1930s. In any case, I had referenced what historians refer to as the Great Clark-Doll experiments. In the 1930s, there's a pair of psychologists that are operating out of New York, and they conduct this psychological experiment. They get several African-American girls, they're literally little girls, and they give them a choice. They can have one of two dolls, okay? Can't have them both, you can only have one. One doll is black, the other doll is white. And every single time they put this choice in front of these little girls, without exception, they all chose the white doll. Why? Right? I mean, they didn't choose the one that resembled them, they didn't choose the one that looked like them, anything like that. They chose the white doll, and it's a really important question to ask why, okay? Over the course of time, I think what we as a society, how we would answer that is that everything around these little girls had reinforced, had buttressed, had emphasized that white is superior. Again, this idea of white supremacy, it's so much more than hoods and crosses and swastikas, and it's not white supremacist in that it's a system, and part of that system is psychological, okay? I mean, think about something for a second. In 1938, 1948, 1958, all of your major politicians, certainly all your presidents, most of your senators, it's even going to be a little while before we see anybody of color on the Supreme Court. They're all white people, okay? And even though we're moving in the direction of integration with professional sports, Babe Ruth is the cultural icon. It's not Satchel Paige, not right now anyway. Movies and popular entertainment, generally speaking, those were all white people. Standards of beauty, okay? Whether that's hair or skin color or just style, generally speaking, this was based on a European model. So again, my point is everything around these girls had been driven home. White is superior, and white is what you want, and white is what you want to be. So naturally, you give them this choice between a white doll and a black doll, and of course they take the white doll because that's what they had been socially conditioned to believe was best. It was superior. You start to see a little bit of a pattern forming with respect to white supremacy, okay? So let's go ahead and put this in the context of Richard Wright. And this is where the rubber's really going to meet the road when it comes to finding important things in the book that you can use in your paper. So what I want you to do, whether this is online or a hard copy like what I have, go ahead and open up to chapter 1, okay? Open up to chapter 1. I am in chapter 1 right now. And this is page 27 if you're following along online. If your book looks like my book, right, I'm on page 23, but it's several paragraphs deep into chapter 1. There's a paragraph that starts out, "I soon made myself a nuisance." Find that paragraph. Again, if you're following along online, that's page 27. Look for the paragraph that begins, "I soon made myself a nuisance." Okay? Just follow my lead on this. I soon made myself a nuisance by asking far too many questions of everybody. Every happening in the neighborhood, no matter how trivial, became my business. It was in this manner that I first stumbled upon the relations between whites and blacks, and what I learned frightened me. Though I had long known that there were people called white people, it had never meant anything to me emotionally. I had seen white men and women upon the streets 1,000 times, but they'd never looked particularly white. To me, they were merely people like other people, yet somehow strangely different because I never had come in close touch with any of them. For the most part, I never thought of them. They simply existed somewhere in the background of the city as a whole. It might have been that my tardiness in learning to sense white people as white people came from the fact that many of my relatives were white-looking people. My grandmother, who was as white as any white person, had never looked white to me. And when word circulated among the black people of the neighborhood that a black boy had been severely beaten by a white man, I felt like the white man had a right to beat the black boy, for I naively assumed that the white man must have been the black boy's father. And did not all fathers, like my father, have the right to beat their children? A paternal right was the only right, to my understanding, that a man had to beat a child. But when my mother told me that the white man was not the father of the black boy, was no kin to him at all, I was puzzled. Then why did the white man whip the black boy? I asked my mother. The white man did not whip the black boy, my mother told me. He beat the black boy. But why? You're too young to understand. I'm not going to let anybody beat me, I said strongly. Then stop running wild in the streets, my mother said. I brooded for a long time about the seemingly causeless beating of the black boy by the white man, and the more questions I asked, the more bewildering it all became. Whenever I saw white people now, I stared at them, wondering what they were really like. This really is an eye-opening experience for him. On the same hand, it's a very confusing situation for him. It's one of those things that he never really gave much thought to white people before, and now all of a sudden this revelation comes that this can be any random person, any random white person on the street that seemingly has the right to beat people like him. So as you might imagine, this is a really confusing and to some extent very, very traumatic experience that he's going through, okay? He's beginning to become conscious of the way that race works in America. He's beginning to become conscious of expectations, both expectations that people have for him and expectations that he might need to have with respect to interacting with people of another race, in particular white people. So let's talk a little bit about a class connection, shall we? Okay. The class connection that I think makes the most sense here would be a Supreme Court case that we've talked about in the past, Brown versus Board of Education, okay? I had noted at the time that one of the things that, the lawyer, guy that's later on going to go on to become a Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, he's going to argue is that the lessons that we learn early on in life, they make a really big impression on us. And sometimes those lessons, those impressions, they stay with us forever and ever and ever. We never really get over them. I think Wright is beginning to have that sort of experience. This is an impression that was made on him at a very early age, and it's going to stay with him for a long time. But keep in mind, Brown versus Board of Education has everything to do with segregated schools. And so what Marshall is going to argue before the court is that if you tell a group of people, especially children, that you just simply can't come to this school, and it's got everything to do with your race, it's nothing else. It's not that you're not smart enough or good looking enough, and none of that, right? It's all about your race, and that is going to instill a sense of inferiority, right? A sense of inferiority, not good enough, inadequate, do not belong here, that's very likely to stay with us for the rest of our lives, okay? And so we can actually see this in real time with Richard Wright when he becomes aware that at any given moment, don't like the look on your face, right? You might be beaten by one of these people, okay? The sense of inferiority begins to set in. So let's move on. Let's talk about another example. And that example is going to come to us in chapter 2. Now, again, if you're following along online, you're going to want to open up to page 46. And as it turns out, this is also on page 46 in the book that I'm using here as well. Now, this is a very, very telling situation, and it's very eye-opening as far as he's concerned. And again, he's in the rural South, he's in adolescence, he's a very young kid, and he's at a train station. Now, if you're at this point in the book, you know that the Wright family or his family bounces around. They have a tendency to bounce around from Arkansas to Tennessee, Tennessee to Arkansas, and Mississippi. You get the idea, okay? So I'm point 46, and it's a paragraph that starts out, "At last we were at the railroad station." Find that paragraph. At last we were at the railroad station with our bags, waiting for the train that would take us to Arkansas. And for the first time, I noticed that there were two lines of people at the ticket window, a white line and a black line. During my visit to Granny's, a sense of the two races had been born in me with sharp concreteness that would never die until I died. When I boarded the train, I was aware that we Negroes were in one part of the train and that the whites were in another. Naively, I wanted to go and see how the whites looked while sitting in their part of the train. So there's a little bit of dialogue. He starts asking, can I go peep at the white folks? And, his mom pretty much tells him, sit down and be quiet, right? We don't have time to deal with that sort of thing right now. And as you might imagine, for a kid, that's really confusing. Like, I want to see the difference. What harm is there in going and taking a look at the difference? So I'm on the next page, and it's a paragraph that starts out, I had begun to notice, find that. I had begun to notice that my mother became irritated when I questioned her about whites and blacks. I could not quite understand it. I wanted to understand these two sets of people who lived side by side and never touched, it seemed, except in violence. Now there was my grandmother. Was she white? Just how white was she? What did the whites think of her whiteness? Mama, is Granny white? I asked as the train rolled through the darkness. If you've got eyes, you can see what color she is, my mother said. I mean, do the white folks think that she's white? Why don't you ask the white folks for that? She countered. But you know, I insisted. Why should I? She asked. I'm not white. Granny looks white, I said, hoping to establish one fact at least. Then why isn't she living, or why is she living with us colored folks? Don't you want Granny to live with us? She asked, blunting my question. And it goes on. There's a little bit more dialogue, but skip down to the part where he says, did Granny become colored? Right, you see that? Did Granny become colored when she married Grandpa? Will you stop asking silly questions? But did she? Granny didn't become colored, my mother said angrily. She was born the color she is right now. Again, I was being shut out of the secret, the thing, the reality I felt somewhere beneath all the words and silences. Why didn't Granny marry a white man, I asked. Because she didn't want to, my mother said peevishly. Why don't you want to talk, I asked. She slapped me and I cried. Later, grudgingly, she told me that Granny came of Irish, Scotch, and French stock, in which Negro blood had somewhere and somehow been infused. She explained it was all a matter of fact, offhand, natural way. Her emotions were not involved at all. And so it dawns on him, you know, that this world is way more complicated than simply black people and white people. There's this in between that is complicating things. Okay. Now, on the one hand, the train example is a very vivid example of segregation. You've got separate lines for the two races. You've got separate cars for the two races. It is the essence of Jim Crow. Okay. I mean, just think about something for a second. The very idea of needing to segregate simply implies the inferiority associated with whomever you're trying to segregate, okay? So there's that, but as it turns out, we've got an example that's pretty similar to what's going on here in Richard Wright. Way at the beginning of the semester, I introduced you to another Supreme Court case entitled Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy is a man much like his Richard Wright's grandmother, okay? A man of mixed racial heritage who at times can pass for white, okay? And so he boards a train in Louisiana who in the 1890s had established these laws of separate riding cars for blacks and whites. It's segregation, legalized segregation. So Plessy goes in, he sits down, and he's promptly thrown out because he's said to be in the whites only part of the train. This situation goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court at that time tells Plessy, listen, as long as those train cars are equal, right, and certainly there was a nod and a wink to that, but as long as they were equal, you could segregate however you wanted to, right? Black, white, rich, poor, short, tall. You get the idea, okay? But basically, guys, it's legalized segregation. And so what he's experienced here has a really vivid context in our class. And it was a constant reminder, not good enough, this racial awakening, never really thought to think about why there were two lines, but you know, once you're seeing that, once you're exposed to that, it begins to make you wonder about the what. And that's certainly what he's asking with respect to the conversation involving his mother, okay? I hope this helps. I hope this makes sense. It's certainly a very good example. You get a lot of mileage out of that one if you choose to use it in the paper. Let's do one more example, okay? We need to talk about the consequences of not really paying close attention to how race is functioning. In other words, ignoring that consciousness or being unconscious of it. Now that I say that, it's a better way of looking at it, okay? I want you to open up to chapter 8, and if you're using the one online, it's page 159, okay? Go to page 159. It's right at the beginning of, actually I take that back. It is a paragraph that starts out on 159. It starts out, empty days, long days. Find that part. Empty days, long days. Bright, hot days. The sun heated the pavements until they felt like the top of an oven. I spent the morning hunting for jobs, and I read during the afternoons. One morning, I was walking toward the center of town and passed the home of a classmate, Ned Greenlee. He was sitting on his porch looking glum. "Hello, Ned, what's new?" I asked. "You haven't heard, have you?" he asked. "About what?" "My brother Bob." "No, what happened?" Ned began to weep softly. "They killed him," he managed to say. "The white folks?" I asked in a whisper, guessing. He sobbed his answer. Bob was dead. I had met him only a few times, but I felt I had known him through his brother. What happened? They took him in a car out on the country road. They shot him, Ned whimpered. I had heard that Bob was working at one of the hotels in town. Why? They said he was fooling with a white prostitute there in the hotel, Ned said. Inside of me, my world crashed and my body felt heavy. I stood looking down a quiet, sun-filled street. Bob had been caught by the White Death, the threat of which hung over every black male in the South. I had heard whispered tales of black boys having sex relations with white prostitutes in the hotels in town, but I had never paid any close attention to them. Now, those tales came home to me in the form of the death of a man I knew. He goes on. I did not search for a job that day. I returned home and sat on my porch, too, and stared. What I had heard altered the look of the world, induced in me a temporary paralysis of will and impulse. The penalty of death awaited me if I made a false move and wondered if it was worthwhile to make any move at all. The things that influenced my conduct as a Negro did not have to happen to me directly. I needed but to hear of them to feel their full effects in the deepest layers of my consciousness. Indeed, the white brutality that I had not seen was more effective control of my behavior than that which I knew. The last part's really telling, and it's really important. I told you that it's violence that really holds this system of white supremacy in place, or in this case, even the threat of violence. Before we move on, let's go ahead and spell something out. The bottom line is, you better know what the rules are. Otherwise, you could have tragic results, like what happened to Bob here, okay? One of the things that I think sticks out in my mind with respect to this example involves, Richard Wright just being blown away by the fact that this seems like it was consensual. It wasn't one person forcing themselves on another person. That might be a little bit more understandable, not excusable, but at least you could, understand it. But because these are two people of free will that decided to engage in these sorts of relations, and one of them was killed because of it, that's really made an impression on him, okay? So not knowing the rules, simply being ignorant, wasn't an excuse. You could suffer death or serious injuries simply by not knowing how the game was played. And I'm not trying to marginalize anything by calling it a game. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say, okay? So with that making sense, let's come back and let's connect this to an example that we've talked about. Now, I told you that the civil rights movement's really going to hit its stride in the post-World War II era. And I told you one thing that's really going to bring this to the attention of the American people would be the lynching of a African-American youth in Mississippi, a person by the name of Emmett Till, okay? Now keep in mind, like I said before, Emmett Till's from Chicago, so he's not a native of Mississippi, which turns out not to matter, okay? And so Emmett Till is essentially, guilty of making a smart alecky comment to a white woman who worked this register at this convenience store. Now, you and I would say that that's just kids being kids. But it's akin, making a pass at a white woman by a black man, right? That was akin to rape. Now, this is completely over Till's head. He doesn't understand what happened. But ultimately, this has a very similar end that Bob had, that Bob suffered in Richard Wright's example, okay? Emmett Till is going to be shot to death by these two men, white men, that are basically going to execute him. He's going to be tried, convicted, and executed more or less for breaking the cardinal sin of the South, the ultimate taboo, certainly in the South, but arguably anywhere at the country at the time, was black male aggression directed toward white female purity, okay? And so, nice connection in a very tragic way that you can bring in our class to something that we've talked about in Richard Wright. And what that's going to do is it's going to reinforce your point that this is not just happening in Richard Wright. Yes, you see it there, but there's all kinds of historical examples that'll bring context to what you're talking about. So what I'd like to do right now in the last few minutes that we have remaining is kind of sum up, okay? This racial consciousness is beginning to unfold in the minds of people like Richard Wright. This is the example, and we can see this very, very vividly. He's beginning to see that there are rules that sort of designate you as a second or even third class citizen. And these rules are learned over time. Sometimes they're very, very implied, and other times they're very, very vivid. You can see two lines at the train station, okay? Whatever the case is, you have to be painfully aware of these rules, because to not be aware of them and to make a faux pas or overstep some imaginary boundary could have lethal consequences, as we've seen with both Emmett Till and with Bob from the story, okay? So you have to essentially learn how to become a second-class citizen once you begin to observe the world around you. In our next installment, we're going to see another way in which white supremacy works, and that's going to be white expectations. How whites expected racial minorities, in this case Richard Wright, to interact with them seemingly on a day-to-day basis. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in just a second. For right now, I hope that this was helpful.